Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a very special guest, Jonathan Haidt, author of the books like Coddling of the American Mind, The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, and currently a professor at NYU-Stern. Is that correct?
That is correct. Hello,
Jonathan,
Erik.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very pleased to be with you.
Jonathan, one of the things you're thinking about a lot, and you just published a piece in The Atlantic about, is social media. And you're a student of history and technology, so you know that anytime a new technology comes out, everyone hates it right away. Yep. And so knowing this, you're still a critic of social media. I'm curious, outline the case. What are the problems with social media, and are they temporary problems that we'll fix within the next few years, or are these really lasting issues we have to deal with?
Yes, so it's always good to start with skepticism. Our species is prone to moral panics. We all, if we give some deep emotional message, people resonate to it more. And you're right, there has been a moral panic to whatever technology the young are using. I used to teach at the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of reading and of novels, and he had to deal with the fact that this new form, novels, was said to incite the passions and desires of young women in particular. So by all means, we have to have a high bar here and not just say, oh my God, the kids, what are they doing? And the research on the effects of television and video games generally didn't show much of a problem. So you're right, let's be skeptical. But there are two main problems I want to focus on. So first, let's be really clear here. I love technology. I mean, I totally love it. I always have. The internet ranks up there with fire and electricity. And of course, fire's done some bad things, and electricity's done some bad things, and the internet's done some bad things. But the balance of benefits from the internet, from smartphone, well, internet for sure, from smartphones, iPhones, I think is clearly positive. And so if we're talking about that, now we're talking about the same things we've had before. So when the automobile came out, there were no stop signs, there were no laws. And, people got hurt. And then gradually we adapted and we got laws and stop signs and driver's licenses. And maybe this will be like that. So if we're talking about tech or the internet, then I'm not afraid. I think we all have to just think clearly about this and look for ways to optimize. My focus is entirely on one subset of tech, and that is social media. And more specifically, social media that allows people to get word out very, very quickly on platforms that have ways of quantifying reach or popularity. That's the problem for teenage mental health, and that's the problem for democracy. So if we could go back to the internet as it was in 2005 or so, when social media was just, hey, MySpace and the Facebook and look at me, here are the bands that I like. That's not toxic. That's not toxic for teenagers. That's not toxic for democracy. The suspicion, the fear that's been looming in me since about 2015, when it was clear things are really weird. Things are really messed up in ways that I can't explain. I feel like by working with Tobias Rose Stockwell, my co-author on the Atlantic article, I think we really were able to narrow in on what it is. And it is the way that social media changed between 2009 and 2013. That's the thing that alarms me. That's what I'd like us to focus on.
And let's talk about that. That's the rise of the newsfeed?
It's three things. So it's the like button, which is the most pervasive and most important thing when we look at teenage mental health. Everything is now quantified. And it's the retweet button, which is particularly important for the democracy problems, less so for teenage mental health. And it's the algorithmicizing the news feed, which, as I understand it, goes back before that period. I talked with Adam Mosseri, and he told me that actually around 2009, they de-algorithmicized things for a while. But the point is that by 2010, 2011, things were much more algorithmicized, and now they had huge amounts of extra information, namely likes, to go on. So yes, it's the way that social media transformed from just a way to say, look at me, here's my address book essentially, and here are the things I like, to a way of putting things out that makes everybody into a brand manager.
Basically, your argument is that it amplifies sort of the worst characteristics of human nature in a way that we can't really protect ourselves from. I'm curious to connect this to your idea of fragility and anti-fragility. And in the same way that we were, 20 years ago trying to protect our kids from, physical violence outside, do you worry in 20 years if we is this making us stronger by facing social media early, or how do you think about anti-fragility?
Yeah. So the fundamental fact, the reason why I don't think this is a moral panic like others, is that this time there's incredibly clear and consistent data across countries that right around 2012, plus or minus 1 or 2 years, curves start shooting upwards. And I don't mean all mental health. It's not like Gen Z. So Gen Z we're talking about, kids born in 1996 and later. And, you might think, oh, they're just all hypochondriacs. They just love to talk about mental illness because they think it's cool or because they've been encouraged to, but it's not a real thing. It's just that they're, no, that is not what's happening because for 3 reasons. One, it's not just the self-report measures. It's suicide and it's self-harm. And they show the very same curves that we see for self-reported data on depression. That's one. Another is that it's happening across countries. And so while you could say, well, why did American kids start getting so depressed at a certain time? Whatever theory you want to give for why these curves are going up for behavior as well as self-report, you'd have to explain why it's happening in Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Now, Australia, New Zealand, I was just there last summer. They're a little bit delayed and it's not as severe, but it's happening. It's happening there too. And so in every country I've looked at, it's probably not everywhere in the world, but in the developed countries, certainly the English-speaking countries, it's happening at the same time in the same way. And the third is that there's a real specificity to the pattern. It's not just random noise that we're misinterpreting. It's always the young women up much more than the young men. And it's whenever you have data broken down by age group, it's the 10 to 14-year-old, the 10 to 14-year-old girls are up much more than anyone else. And so some people might say, oh, it's the global financial crisis. They're worried about getting jobs. No, that would have hurt the millennials. It was the millennials who had their job prospects devastated. If you're Gen Z, if you're born in say the year 2000, all you've ever known from the time you were aware of, newspapers and the news, all you've ever known really is rising stock market and declining unemployment. So there is no other explanation that anyone can come up with for why this is global, why it affects girls the most, why it affects preteen girls the most. It's social media. At least that's what I don't want to overstate it. I'm in a debate now. We have to work this out in terms of evidence. I'm in a debate. A few of us on one side thinking, arguing that it is a causal factor. It's not just a correlation. And then there are some psychologists at Oxford, Shabilsky and Orban in particular, who are arguing that the effects are tiny. So, that'll get worked out over the next year or two. But that's where we are. It's not tech, it's social media. So just to be clear, what I think is going on with the kids is that the chronic social comparison, the fact that everyone's life looks better than yours, the fact that boys' aggression is physical, so it doesn't get ramped up by going online, whereas girls' aggression is relational, and so social media really ramps that up. So for a lot of reasons, Gen Z is coming out fragile, anxious. They think words are violence. They easily buy into notions of safetyism. So all that stuff. Now, to be clear, Gen Z bears no blame whatsoever for the mess this country is in. I mean, us older generations, we messed it up. And we were messing it up before social media. The rise of polarization is often dated to the rise of cable TV. And so there were a lot of factors that made the mid to late 20th century very low on polarization. And think about it in terms of centrifugal forces blowing America outward and centripetal forces pulling us in. Coming off of World War II and then having the Cold War. And for a lot of reasons, America was at its peak of cohesion in the mid to late 20th century. 1968 was an explosive year. There were a lot of centrifugal forces there, but the centripetal forces were so strong throughout that period. We can trace the rise of cross-partisan hatred of mass polarization to the 1980s with cable TV, because we go from broadcasting, which is good for democracy, we're all on the same page, to narrowcasting, cable TV. So that starts the process. And as I see it, again, I'm not a political scientist, I get some pushback on this from people on the right, but as I see it, cable TV really affected the right. They were able to master the form. They had a lot of shows that really, there's a book called The Outrage Industry by Sarah Sobieraj and somebody else, I forget the author. So the right really mastered it. The left never really mastered the form. They couldn't get shows that really mattered. So I think the right begins to radicalize in the 90s, especially from cable TV and then Fox News.
What led to their radicalization? Terrorism or fear of terrorism or?
No, it's just, so there's, so you have elite polarization comes first. So if you look at Congress, we get sorting into left. So we used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats for a variety of reasons, Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act, all sorts of things. The parties purify so that by the 90s, all the liberals are in one party, all the conservatives are in another. But the people aren't polarized yet. The people don't hate each other yet. But the leaders, the Congress people, and in the media, we get much more elite polarization in the 90s. And tech has nothing to do with this other than cable TV. But in the early 2000s, we start to see the rise of mass polarization. And if you look, especially Pew has really good data on this, Gallup does too. If you look at what people think of the people on the other side or of the party on the other side, they actually didn't hate the people on the other side until the late 90s or early 2000s. That's when it starts. And the lines begin going up sort of in the very early stage of social media. I don't think it was responsible then. But after 2012, after this period we're talking about, where we've essentially built an outrage machine, that's where the media, the mainstream media and social media are locked in an embrace. They can't escape each other. They're locked together in ways that speed up the news cycle, speed up polarization, make us vulnerable to fake news. So that's the basic facts about rising polarization. Now, the reason why that's so important for everything else is that as long as we hate each other, our passions drive our reasoning. So when we have really strong cross-partisan hatred, we'll believe anything. We'll believe anything the Russians give us. And it turns out the Russians didn't even need to give us crap. They didn't even need to give us lies. We were happy to circulate them ourselves. They didn't need to create the bots. We were the bots, effectively. So that's the big picture story. We can zoom in on social media's role, but the big picture story is that in the 1990s, it looked like democracy was not just stable, it was inevitable. Do you remember the period where we thought this was the end of history? Let's just wait for North Korea and Iran to get rich, and then there'll be liberal democracies too. And now we know that's not true.
Yeah, I want to get to what Facebook can do about it, but on that polarization topic, when did when did the illiberal left start forming or start populating? Yeah.
So there've always been illiberals on both sides. So the right has always had its John Birchers and its neo-Nazis. And that was always an argument you could see very visibly on the right. At National Review, they kind of pushed out the extreme, but they were always there. On the left, there's always been an illiberal left. It was attracted to totalitarian communism. But the sort of the broad center left, which is where most people in journalism and the academy were throughout my life. When I was in grad school in the 90s, like almost everybody's on the left, but it's sort of, we're all like liberals, not illiberal. And there was always like the illiberals, but they were always over in like the gender studies and race studies departments. There were views there that were more activist and not really interested in, like John Stuart Mill, liberal society. People should be free to live the lives they want, and we need viewpoint diversity. We need to be able to talk to each other. That sort of liberal consensus, sort of a left liberal consensus, is what dominated elite institutions for a very long time. I'd say up until 2014, really, or 2015. And then what happens in universities is that around 2015, this wave of this new morality comes crashing through, and we were totally taken by surprise. It wasn't driven by the faculty in this case, it was driven by the students. And Greg Lukianoff was the first to diagnose it. My friend Greg, who runs the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, because he's working on college campuses, defending free speech rights, of students. And for the first time in 2014, he sees college students asking for protection from words and books and speakers. So he comes to me with this idea that somehow we're teaching students the very same cognitive distortions that Greg had learned to not do. So Greg and I first thought, our first hypothesis, which was wrong, was that colleges were somehow teaching students to think in these distorted ways. Our second hypothesis, so that's what we wrote up in our Atlantic article in 2015. And right after it came out, everything blew up. Greg saw this in 2014, but it was at Halloween 2015 at Yale. That was the spark, but it then goes national. All the protests, the demands for safe spaces, trigger warnings, bias response teams, all the crazy stories of, professors being shouted down and speakers being shouted at. All that comes in a tidal wave in 2015 to 2017. But it was only after that that we realized in 2017, when Jean Twenge's book, iGen, came out, then we could, for the first time, really see the data on mental health and see, oh my God, something really happened to kids born after 1996, hugely high rates of depression, anxiety, fragility, and they arrived on campus in 2014. So our second hypothesis was it wasn't that colleges caused this, it was that the tidal wave of Gen Z anxiety and depression and frailty came to us on campus in 2014, 2015, and that's why it happened nationally. So colleges didn't cause it, something in about American childhood did. And that's where I started getting interested in the role of social media. But even that hypothesis, it turns out, wasn't entirely true. I think it is true, but there's a big piece missing, which is a lot of other institutions began to go haywire around the same time. And this is before Trump is elected. And that's the point of my Atlantic article with Tobias, which is that social media created this outrage machine, which greatly amplified the voices of the illiberal left and the illiberal right. So the fact that we have Nazis, actual Nazis, I mean, they were always there, there are not many of them, but suddenly, a few hundred or a couple thousand young men can become this national and global issue. America is absolutely not an anti-Semitic country. I'm Jewish. I love this country. I've seen the data. Jews are the most popular religious group in the country, and it's just going up and up and up for all religious groups. We're not an anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim country on average, but the outrage machine amplifies the voice of the small minority that really are anti-Semitic or anti-Islamic or homophobic, etc. Our politics goes haywire. News media goes haywire. Talk to people in newsrooms. The dynamics are really changing in the last few years. So social media has changed the basic connective tissue of society in ways that, while we might adapt to it, I think the change is so fast and so pervasive, and our democracy is now so fragile that I think we really have to consider the real possibility of catastrophic collapse. Catastrophic political collapse in this country in the next 10 or 15 years.
And are you optimistic that Facebook can do anything about this? Is it as fundamental as they have to change their business model? I think that's what Tobias, I've spoken to him a couple times, it might say, or what needs to happen here, or what's possible?
Yeah. So I think, look, I know a lot of people who work at Facebook. I've spoken there a few times. I've spoken to a bunch of people at Facebook. I think it's a company full of idealistic people. This is not a story about bad people. But I think it is a story about a business model in which we are not the customers, we are the product. And so the incentives are such that the things that would really help are things that would probably cut into their revenue. One of the most important things I think we have to do is we must require some sort of identity authentication to let people open an account. I think it should be to open any account. Tobias thinks maybe we could get by with just opening an account that can reach more than 100 people or something. But the age where anyone can just get in a car and drive without a license, I think that age is over. I think that social media, where anybody can open 1,000 accounts and make death threats and rape threats. They can interfere with other countries' elections. They can shame people. They can bully people. I think that age needs to come to an end. And for that to come to an end, that means we have to have some sort of identity authentication. I'm not saying we need to driver's licenses to Facebook. There could be there should be probably a third-party nonprofit, I don't know what it would be, where you have to show some form of identification. And I understand that wouldn't work for the whole world. I think we're past the point. I think it's clear we can't all be on one platform. What they need in Myanmar or Egypt is not what we need here. And I think if we all try to stay on one platform with the lowest possible level of verification, then I think democracies are going to die, and I think ours may be one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes me think a couple things. One is this idea of you brought up John Stuart Mill earlier. You're a huge fan of him. He has this idea, the harm principle, right? Which is act as such that you aren't causing harm to anybody. And today we use speech as harm, or we treat speech as violence, and that's sort of a big evolution. But I wonder if Robert Wright also has his book Non-Zero, which I believe you've read.
I love that book. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm curious what you took from that book. One of the things I took from that book is that we're more interconnected than ever, and thus our actions influence other people more than ever. And the way where that's more clearly seen is the environment. Like John Stuart Mill wasn't thinking about climate change.
Right.
And so how do you think about this idea of the harm principle as it's evolved over time? Obviously, it's not, my speech isn't directly causing harm to you necessarily, as people might lead it to believe, but how do you think about the evolving idea of harm?
So the basic principle here is that the liberal tradition, and like the liberal democracy tradition, the liberal tradition of the West over the last few hundred years, is an extraordinary move towards individual liberty, away from, be it religious, totalitarianism or any kind of totalitarianism. And in America, more than in Europe, we extend that to economic freedom, economic liberty. We think that if somebody invents a company and people want to buy that company's products, in general, the government should stay away unless there's clear harm to third parties. That's one of the major needs for regulation, is to prevent or price in harmful externalities to others. So I think that in general, the harm principle, the idea that we don't regulate, we don't stop people from doing things unless it's clear that they're harming others. That's a very solid principle. And we don't necessarily just take people's word for it. So if people say speech is violence, I'm harmed by it. As Mill said, they always say that. They always claim that. That's not enough. But when we start to see the data on this extraordinary epidemic of depression and anxiety, and to be clear, the suicide rate is up for almost all ages for both sexes. But it's up, in the range of like 20 to 30% for most age groups. It's up 70 or 80% for older teen girls. It's up 150% for preteen girls. So this is not like we're saying like, oh, gee, maybe it's up a little bit. No, it's like, more than doubled for preteen girls. This is big. A lot of people are dying. And I think actually the Facebook in particular, and Instagram, I think they are particularly vulnerable to a gigantic class action lawsuit if it can be shown. It's not conclusive yet, but if it is conclusively shown that underage use is harmful more so than adult use, and since they seem to make very little effort to keep people off, I do think they're exposing themselves to a gigantic class action lawsuit in the 2020s. So back to the harm principle. If it's clear that 11, 12-year-old girls on Instagram become much more anxious and see themselves as inferior and see their lives as less good and see themselves as less beautiful, and therefore are anxious, and to relieve that anxiety they cut themselves and sometimes they kill themselves. This pretty clearly qualifies for John Stuart Mill's harm principle. So I do think that the major platforms will have to be forced to deal with underage use. It's not enough. They've told me, various people say, oh, when we know it's underage, we always kick them off. Yeah, I never curse, but in this case I will. Bullshit. Complete, total bullshit. My son, when he entered, my daughter's in 5th grade. Her girlfriend started getting Instagram in 4th grade. In 5th grade now it's much more common. My son, when he entered 6th grade, he said, everybody but me has Instagram. Everybody just lies and nobody gets kicked off. So yeah, I think the changes that have to be made about identity verification, age verification, that's the only way to keep underage kids off. That, I think, would be the biggest thing we could do to address the mental health crisis of teenagers around the world. And yeah, that's going to be very costly. That's going to, that probably, I don't know what the numbers are. That would probably cut the number of people in half who have accounts.
And when we compare this to sort of the complaints around microaggressions or speech as violence in colleges, is sort of the main difference that age, basically, like when you're a teenager, you can't really, fend for yourself in the same way that when you're a college student, Van Jones, we want you to be strong, put up your boots, etc. Is that sort of the main difference?
Well, no, everybody's anti-fragile. And, and if some of your listeners have heard me speak before, they're probably sick of this, but it is the most important concept out there in terms of the psychology of what's happening. And the basic idea just being that we're just like, the immune system is anti-fragile. If you protect it from dirt, germs, and, bacteria, it can't grow strong. It needs exposure to grow strong. Kids need to be teased. They need to be excluded. They need to experience stress, not long-term stress, but lots of short-term stress. And if we protect them from that, we're not helping them, we're hurting them. And so I often get the question when I speak, okay, Haidt, you're saying we need to stop protecting our kids. We need to send them out and they let them get hurt. But then you say we should protect them from social media. Why can't they go out on social media and get hurt? To which I say, in theory, you're right. And that makes a certain sense from a distance. But it turns out that being shamed on social media is nothing like falling down on a playground and skinning your knee. And we can't escape our biologicality. We're not virtual creatures. We're physical creatures who need to develop face-to-face skills, conflict negotiation skills, and doing it virtually doesn't seem to help. When I speak to audiences of Gen Z, I always ask them, overall, do you think that being on social media early, as most of you were, being on it early and being publicly shamed or humiliated and having those bad experiences, did it make you stronger or did it make you more afraid? Did it make you more fearful, more self-censoring? And the overwhelming response is that it made them more fearful, more self-censoring. Being shamed on social media is not at all like experiencing negative events in the physical world. It's just 10, 11, 12-year-old kids are just not ready for it. Middle school is the hardest part of life, and social media has made it 10 times harder.
And it makes me think two things. One is this idea we're supposed to be in this age of the sovereign individual where we have the most freedom possible. And yet when it comes to psychological sovereignty, we're also the most targeted and have least freedom in some ways.
Yeah.
And it makes,
I think that's right. There are a lot of paradoxes here. And I just really want to draw a line at the age of 18. That is, if we're talking about adults making choices, we can lament that they're giving up their sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the kind of debates that people have been talking about for decades and, amusing ourselves to death on television. So if we're talking about adults, you'd really have to show clear evidence of harm, and the presumption and the burden of proof is on those who want to show harm. But when we're talking about kids and teenagers, those who are under 18, we have to be a lot more protective. The evidence is overwhelming that there is an epidemic of anxiety and depression. Nobody doubts that. I've had no pushback on that. If listeners go to thecoddling.com and then click on Solutions, Better Mental Health, I've got 2 open source lit reviews there. There's no dispute about the tidal wave of depression and anxiety. And I think the evidence is increasingly clear that social media plays a causal role. It's not just correlation, it's causal. Although there it's not 100% certain. But I think we need to really be focusing on protecting teenagers.
Totally. And there's a broader question too in terms of institutional design, whether it's social media or otherwise. When do you sort of design for the constraints of our evolutionary flaws and foibles versus sort of ask us to overcome them? We used to enjoy public hangings, and now we have laws against them, or we have nation states. I'm not sure if that's natural to develop at that scale. How do you think about sort of institutional design as it relates to our evolutionary constraints, but also our ability to overcome those constraints?
Oh, the public hangings, that's a great one. Because you're absolutely right. As I in The Righteous Mind, I really focus on how we evolve for small-scale tribalism, intergroup conflict, religious ritual, and public hangings and floggings are great fun. People have always loved them. And eventually we decided, or rather there is a kind of a moral progress about dignity of the individual. And even if the masses love a public hanging, society evolves so that many people say, well, this is inhuman, inhumane. And so I think when you have strong market incentives to grab eyeballs, when you have an attention economy and attention is money, well, then it's quite clear, as well, I'm actually friends with Nir Ayala. He and I are good friends, even though we don't see eye to eye on this, but I think his book Hooked was really all about how do you exploit those evolved vulnerabilities. And now his new book, Indistractable, I think is a really nice correction to that. But from a free market perspective, the competition, is to exploit those vulnerabilities. And so we have to have a combination of regulation and it's just sort of evolving social norms and moral progress. Again, when we're talking about kids, the exploitation, we don't allow slot machines in school. So we just wouldn't do that. But we do allow them to bring in their phones. And I don't think we should be doing that.
I want to go back to some of the related topics around polarization and activism. You've spoken and written a lot about what's happening on college campuses. You did this interview with Jordan Peterson. He has sort of had this offhand comment I want to dig into, which was basically, or you've mentioned that sort of the activism sort of mirrors sort of a fundamentalism in some ways. And I'm curious, he had this offhand comment about when were declining in religious practice, and basically has politics replaced religion in terms of our identity, meaning, and sort of the tribal nature with which we bring to it?
Yes, I think that's exactly what has happened. So we evolved for small-scale religion, and that means we make something sacred. And typically it's a rock or a tree or an ancestor, an animal, and that becomes a totem or a god. And then we circle around it, and we have rituals, and we have taboos, words we can't say, animals that we can't eat depending on what clan you're in. This is normal, evolved human religion. We didn't evolve for gigantic monotheistic religions. Those were cultural evolutions that kind of hacked into our tribalism and were able to scale up much larger communities. So we had a period of a few thousand years where we left the small-scale religion behind, and most people in the developed world were members of large-scale moralistic monotheistic religions, or in India, not monotheistic. So that was a period of a few thousand years, and I think that period might be ending now. Our brains haven't changed. We still have religious brains, and we now have a competition among meaning systems to jack into those brains, and whichever ones tap into them or jack into them and hook them up get to keep them. And so I think we're seeing the rise of these really, truly religious practices. And just the metaphors are revealing. On the far right, they talk about being red-pilled, and the idea that I will have an awakening. I will see reality as in the Matrix. And the reality, is I guess about the crazy leftists and all that. And some people who are red-pilled then actually become amenable to Nazism and neo-Nazi ideas. So ideas about what's sacred and seeing the world as a battle between good and evil, this Manichaean struggle, this is innate to us, by which I don't mean we have to live that way, but it's the default. It's easy to get people to live that way. So it's clear on the right, but it's just as clear on the left, where the metaphor is woke. It's the same metaphor. It's the idea that I have awakened. I now see things about power and privilege that most people are blind to. And I'm not denying that there's a lot about power and privilege that members of the majority culture don't see. So it's not that the metaphor is completely inappropriate, but what it activates, it taps into the ancient religious rituals. And the clearest sign of this is blasphemy laws. So on college campuses now, before 2015, if you were in a law class, if you were a class in law school on First Amendment, and you were talking about a legal case in which the N-word was involved, the professor could say the N-word or could read it in a transcript. Or if you're in a literary class where there is a book in which the N-word is in the title, or if you were reading Mark Twain, or anything that has the word could be said in class and you wouldn't be fired for it, because it's clear you're not calling someone that. But once we had this, what's now called the Great Awakening. There's now, we didn't know this when we wrote even the book, but a lot of research came out just like in the last year on the General Social Survey, when it's become clear that white people on the left moved sharply to the left around 2014. And again, this is exactly the period. This is in part because of the transformation of social media. White people on the left, not black people, but white people on the left go sharply far to the left on matters of race, immigration, gender. So there was a great awakening among white progressives.
And why was it a great awakening instead of a great, right-wing or whatever, more traditional religion or some other right-wing sort of?
Yeah, because the social conservatives still had actual religion like Christianity and things like that. But the left has been, and Democrats have been leaving churches for a long time. In the 70s, if you knew someone went to church, you didn't necessarily know how they voted. But now if you know someone goes to church, every week, you know how they voted pretty much. So the left has been leaving religion rapidly since the 70s or 80s. But it's being replaced, I think, by quasi-religions. And I think wokeness is best understood as a fundamentalist religion that has certain sacred objects, and it has very severe blasphemy laws. So if you use certain words, you must be expelled. I mean, you're not going to literally be killed. Let's be clear. The far right actually shoots people, and the far right has actual, real terrorists. The far left doesn't. I mean, okay, we talk about Antifa, but they're not killing people the way that the Christchurch shooter is.
But is it fundamentally sort of, I've heard it described as sort of a sort of a cultural Marxism or egalitarianism, that instead of, it used to be class-based, now it's race-based, and the goal is sort of, equality, and using sort of race as the entry point, equality of outcome?
Well, so yes, egalitarianism is central to this fundamentalist religion, but it's not comprehensive egalitarianism. It's not that we should all be equal. It's focused on race, gender, and not so much even LGB anymore. It's T. It's the transgender issue is very big now. So it's not that equality is the end goal. It's a real focus on 3 or 4 different kinds of social groups, and that's what the fundamentalism is. There can be no challenge, no question about it. And what that means is that organizations that are striving for diversity are in a hell of a bind, because diversity, if you do it right, and if it's done with a sense of humility and acceptance and tolerance, humility can bring benefits. But the research on the benefits of diversity is pretty sparse. The case is not as strong as many people think. The basic social science view is that diversity is by its nature divisive. People divide at the drop of a hat, and we have to work to get people to work together. So if you increase diversity and you do it right, you can get all kinds of benefits. But if you increase diversity and you don't do it right, you get just increased division and hostility. And so if you want diversity and inclusion, well, that's really hard, because a lot of the ways we do diversity create diversity and conflict, eternal conflict. It's not a coincidence that the institutions that get most torn apart over racism charges are not those who are conservative, or places where you might think that there would be more actual racist things said. It's schools like Yale and Middlebury and Evergreen. It's the most progressive universities that went down into torrents of racial conflict. It's the most progressive religions. The Unitarians, from what I hear, are now being torn apart over these sorts of things. And I think it's the most progressive companies. So I think it's important, certainly in the tech sector and any other place that hires from elite American colleges, it's important that you not import a view of diversity that's going to make diversity divisive. There are a lot of wonderful people who are writing now. Actually, I'll just get out my list, but like, Irshad Manji has a book, Don't Label Me. Ibu Patel has been writing beautiful and really insightful work on different kinds of diversity. I'm incredibly pessimistic in general, but one of the few bright spots is that a lot of people who are not white males are saying, this is nuts. This is completely nuts. We should not be turning people against each other.
Even in a few years, the term woke itself has turned from something to aspire to something, potentially even derogatory or flip.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, obviously people on the right are going to use it in a derogatory way. So that just becomes a polarizing thing. What's interesting to me is that a lot of people with really impeccable progressive credentials on the left are beginning to talk about it, about how dangerous it is, both for the true liberal values and more specifically for the Democrats strategically. So George Packer has a really powerful essay in the New Yorker, or was it the Atlantic, When the Culture War Comes for the Kids, in which he points to 2014 as the year that the white progressive education establishment in Brooklyn went insane and stopped caring about the welfare of kids and became much more focused on a small set of identity issues.
Right. And how did the institutions sort of let this happen? Like, how did the left win the culture war in such a landslide? Is it sort of, white guilt? Are there evolutionary how did it sort of happen?
Yeah. Well, so I think, right. So I think in many ways it's been a Pyrrhic victory. The left absolutely has won the culture war. But and obviously the incredible transformation by which gay marriage went from unthinkable to being normal is a wonderful victory. So I mean, there's a lot good to be said here.
Yeah.
And the wouldn't have happened without activists and people pushing. So let me be clear that many good things have happened here. But I do think in some ways it's a Pyrrhic victory. And if Donald Trump is reelected, it will be the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. Because, so my whole piece, the piece that's really brought me into this is the necessity of viewpoint diversity for finding the truth. So I'm a social scientist, I'm a social psychologist, and I study morality and politics and some controversial stuff. And, when I'm criticized, when people point out flaws in my work, I benefit. Like I actually can correct myself, and people do point out flaws in my work. But if you're on the majority side, if you produce work on diversity or race or gender that is pleasing, people won't work very hard to find flaws. In fact, if there are major known flaws, often nobody dares to say anything.
Right.
And so you can get terrible, terrible work, not only published, but widely believed. I'll give, oh my God, just, we had the most amazing recent example, some of you may have heard about. So, many of your listeners will have heard that when orchestras started using curtains, that caused the number of women hired to jump by 50% immediately. Now, I'd heard that many times, and I assumed it was an experiment. I assumed that they did a controlled experiment, and they found that when you put a curtain up, the number of women increases, and it makes total sense, that there are implicit biases. Like, that makes total sense. But it turns out that's not at all true. It turns out it was based on one article that pointed out that in some year, I forget what year, there was a certain number of women in orchestras, and around then, orchestras started using screens, and then some number of years later, the number of women had increased by 50%, and there was no evidence that the screens had done anything. And there was no claim that it was even 50%. It's just the point is, a claim was made in the media about a diversity issue. Everyone believed it, and no one even bothered to read the article. If people had simply read the article, they would have seen that wasn't true. So my point is that when we are all on the same team, when we passionately want the same thing, we can't be trusted to do research. We just can't be trusted. Motivated reasoning is so powerful. And so your question was, how did this happen? And the answer is, if you take an institution like a university, and it would happen in the military, it could happen anywhere. If you take an institution and you kill all the dissidents, you kill everybody who differs, you expel them or kill them so that everybody thinks the same way, what do you think happens? Groupthink, and there's no break. There's nobody saying, maybe we should only go this far and no farther. Nobody can say that. People just say, okay, let's go farther. Oh, I'll raise you. Oh, I'm even more radical. Right. So this is what I see happening in some academic disciplines, and it may seem like a short-term victory for those who think the point is victory, but a lot of us in universities think the point is truth. And if you care about truth, if you want to get truth, you can't get that if we're all on the same team and if we shoot our dissidents.
Man, a few things here. So one, I want to go back to egalitarianism. You mentioned you were writing a book about capitalism, I believe, the different stories of capitalism. And one thing I'm curious about, it's people often differentiate between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, but it seems that those are more interlinked than we like to think, obviously, because, generations happen and then, people get ahead and thus their kids have better opportunity. Is equality of opportunity just an unhelpful slogan, or what's the KPI for equality or metric for equality of opportunity, or how should we even think about it? Or is equality sort of this like virus that we should stop thinking about as more overall prosperity? How should we think about it?
Yeah, so my own research is on moral foundations theory, and clearly fairness is a very deep moral foundation. You'll never find a human society that doesn't care a lot about fairness. And I thought about having an equality foundation, like maybe equality is this deep thing, because human beings lived in egalitarian ways for a long time. But there's very little evidence that people care about equality of outcome. As Paul Bloom has put it, Paul Bloom at Yale studying development of children, what he finds is that all around the world, people prefer fair inequality to unfair equality. So we don't value equality of outcome per se. What we value is fairness. And fairness is really proportionality. It's the idea that people should get according to what they've given, the law of karma. If you do the crime, do the time. So that's universal. That's very deep. And particularly in the United States, the notion of equality of opportunity is very deep, is widely accepted on left, on right. Everybody accepts equality of opportunity. Now, what you're just referring to is somewhere like the Dream Hoarder work by Richard Reeves and others, showing that simply saying, well, anyone's free to apply to Yale, isn't enough, because obviously, members of the upper class or the upper middle class have been grooming their kids for a long time. So what historically happens is the right tends to have a relatively low bar for when they'll certify equality of opportunity. Like, all right, Jim Crow's over, no more legal discrimination, so we're all set. Whereas the left will say, no, wait a second. And as I think it was President Johnson said, what freedom is not enough. That if people are starting at different positions, it's not a fair race, as it were. So that's a good, healthy, normal argument for democracy to have, in which the left is going to push for more efforts to equate opportunity. That's great. And the Ivy League admission scandal really showed the disgusting degree to which members of the elite will go to cheat to get their kids into elite schools. So we have a lot of work to do there to achieve equality of opportunity. Now, equality of outcome, that's something that very few people are committed to. It's a religious principle in this new fundamentalist religion. And the way it's enforced is, oh my God, actually I can find a tweet. There was an education conference in Seattle, and somebody posted a screenshot of a slide that was shown, and it basically said, if you attribute any outcome differences to anything other than systemic oppression, that's the definition of bigotry. And so the effort here is to say, if women are underrepresented in tech, let's say, there could be many reasons for that, one of which can be hostile climate or discrimination. Those are certainly likely candidates. But there are many candidates, including differences of interest. There are very few differences of ability by sex, but there are big differences of interest. And should we consider that when we try to achieve gender fairness and gender equality in tech? Should we consider the pipeline? Should we consider the applicant pool? Should we consider things like that? Or should we start from the proposition that any disparity is caused by systemic sexism? Well, any social scientist worth his or her salt would say, well, of course we're not going to rule explanations out of bounds a priori. Of course we're not going to. Of course we're going to look at base rates. You have to look throughout the pipeline. At what point is the base rate in the pipeline not represented in the next phase? But what's happening now is that if you suggest that there could be other causes, you can get in big trouble. And that means that we will never solve these problems. If we're not free to think, if we're not free to examine all the causes, we will never solve these problems. And so that's one of my many concerns. As I see it, we have an enormous number of very serious problems, all of which are solvable, but most of which we will not solve because we can't talk straight or think straight.
A couple directions I want to go to in closing. One is this idea of the balance between activism and truth-seeking, which we sort of put you put a different odds, which I understand why. But let's say that someone today sees a great injustice, like animals being slaves or animals being slaughtered.
Factory farming.
Yes, factory farming. They want to make a big change, and they think that that the principles of truth-seeking are not working. They're not leading to this change. When is it justified to pursue activism? How do you think about the balance of truth and activism?
The most important thing I can contribute to this discussion is the importance of specifying the institution. So if you're talking about people in their private lives make that decision that they're sick of studying, they want to go out and act, that's one thing. But I'm talking about universities. If we look at universities, there should be certain norms. If we talk about government or Congress, there should be certain norms. There may be times when Congress people should take extraordinary efforts that break decorum. There may be times, but it should all be in the service of Congress's institutional obligations, duties, and I like to use the word telos, the Greek word telos, or good or purpose. In a university, our purpose is truth. Our purpose is research, and then passing on not just knowledge, but habits of thinking, so that future generations can add to that knowledge. And when we have departments or areas or people who are putting activism ahead of truth, activism and truth-seeking are often incompatible. Then we are no longer able to achieve our telos. So let's look at a specific example. A lot of the activists in 2015 pushed for bias response teams, and microaggression training and things like that. And you can understand why. If they think that Yale and other places are shot through with racism, you want to teach people to be less racist, and then you want a reporting system so that anyone who says anything racist can be reported and disciplined or punished or expelled. But social systems are complicated, and if you don't understand them and you don't think about future consequences, you tend to make things worse. So I don't think it's a good idea for teenagers to be activists unless they have studied a system very, very deeply. I don't think it's a good idea for anyone to say, I'm going to change this institution, not by making good arguments, but by making threats, by basically forcing the president to meet our demands because we're going to make such a stink and we're going to bring such bad attention. We're going to force the president to adopt policies that we want, even if they don't want it. Now, there may be times to do that, and obviously desegregation in the South was a time when there were sick institutions and sick laws. But at a place like Yale, which is a very progressive, anti-racist place, I mean, I went there as an undergrad in the 80s, have these lists of demands for reforms. When you don't understand the system, when you don't think about unintended consequences, is a really bad idea. So we now have biased response teams at a lot of universities. Well, guess what? We're all afraid of each other now. I can't address the things I'm talking about with you, the things I can say here with you, I couldn't say in a classroom. Because in a classroom, if I offend a single student, if there's 300 students in the class, I offend a single student, they can report me before class is over anonymously. So that really changes the climate in ways that are now incompatible with our telos. If we can't talk about anything controversial, we can't do our jobs. So that's a case in which I think on-campus activism has damaged the telos of the university. And an activist university is not one that deserves any sort of public subsidy. It's not one that will produce reliable research. And in the long run, it's not one that will help the Democratic Party. When universities are seen as just the back office, the research department of the Democratic Party, then you can understand why Republican legislators cut funding. There are a lot of Pyrrhic victories here. There's a lot of activism for activism's sake, which can often make systems worse and can backfire on the very goals of the activists.
I'm curious to hear you talk a bit about identity and sort of the tension between, we are evolved for and find meaning in small tribal communities, family, this is my, race or religion, this is my intellectual tribe, whatever, different tribes that we have on us. And we keep, fragmenting into smaller groups. Mm-hmm. At the same time, a lot of our global problems require global cooperation, climate change, AI, mm-hmm. nuclear proliferation. Yep. And we also have, we've been consolidating into bigger nation states. How do you think about sort of, and I know you have your point on common humanity identity, but practically 100 years from now, 200 years from now, for example, do you expect there to be hundreds of more, Singapores and Israels and, et cetera, Hong Kong? Or do you expect, the empires to get bigger and bigger and us to have this sort of common identity?
I wouldn't dare make any prediction about 100 years from now, not a single one, other than that we'll be more interconnected and probably more prosperous. But beyond that, it's very hard to make predictions. I can, for the next few years, I think things are likely to continue getting worse, but I can't really say beyond that. But here's the thing I've been thinking about just in the last few weeks a lot. When I think about, so I was born in 1963 at a time when Jim Crow was the law of the land in many states. I was born 2 months after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And when I look at the way the world, the way the country was back then, the extraordinary injustice, the ugliness, the violence, and then I look decade by decade, from 63 to 73 to 83 to 93, decade by decade, the extraordinary progress on almost every front that any progressive would care about. And I remember in the 90s thinking, my God, we should all be dancing in the streets about how good the world is getting and the Cold War is over and we're making progress on rights for everybody. This is amazing. And so the way that I see it, we can sort of summarize the second half of the 20th century with this simple formulation. You know that thing that people always did where we divide people into groups and then we hate them based on their group membership? How about if we do less of that rather than more of that? And that's what my entire life has been up until 2015. That's the way everything was going. Doesn't mean things were perfect. And we kept discovering new groups that we hadn't noted, like transgender people. We had, so that's progress. That's great. So I think we should be dancing in the streets saying, my God, things have gotten better for almost everybody so fast. nobody could have guessed that things would get this much better this fast. And then in 2015, it all turns around, not because our progress stops, but because of social media. Now we have no connection to the average. We have no idea what the average is. What we see are the most spectacular examples of ugliness. And so even though America is increasingly philo-Semitic, meaning increasingly liking of Jews and Muslims too, the Pew data shows liking of all groups is going up. Even though the averages continue, that 1963 to now, things are getting better and better on average, but the average doesn't matter anymore. In the age of social media, we have no idea what the average is. All we know is the most viscerally upsetting, viral, horrible example. And this enrages activists on the left, and then also, the outrages by people on the left, those go around right-wing Twitter and right-wing YouTube. So we get the extremes being completely enraged, demanding illiberal policies to check the other side, and everything's reversing. So I think that from 1963 to 2015, we made extraordinary moral progress, and now I think we're morally going backwards. Anytime we have less due process, that's moral retrogression. Anytime we judge people more by their group, that's moral retrogression. Anytime we have mob violence and mob justice, that's moral retrogression. So extraordinary progress throughout my life until 2015, and in the last 4 years, I'd say we're morally worse off. America is a morally worse society in a lot of ways. We're going backwards, and I think it's very dangerous for us.
Yeah, the reversing is really interesting. It's sort of, if you look of like China's become much more capitalist as we become much more egalitarian. It's sort of left is right, right is left cycle.
Things are certainly getting mixed up. I think this goes back to the fundamental question and the age-old questions about democracy, which the founders had. And so here, I guess, let's just leave it with this. Let me see if I can find some of the quotes. So I think everybody should go back and read Federalist 10, which is Madison's meditation on the dangers of democracy. And Madison talks about how he writes, such democracies, here he means direct democracies, have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. And the American experiment was to give democracy one more try. It was to say, maybe if we get it just right, if we tweak things, if we don't really have a democracy, if we have a republic with democratic features, we don't want the people to vote on policies, we want them to vote on the people who will make the policies. They put in all kinds of checks and balances, all kinds of ways of slowing things down. And Madison, and this is really the quote that launched the Atlantic article, Madison meditates on how a small republic, a small polity has certain advantages, but it's always ultimately dies because of faction. It always is torn apart by faction, by teams that care only about fighting the other team. They don't care about the common good. And he says, but a very large republic, on the other hand, has a certain advantage. It's so big that if a fire starts in one part, it can't spread throughout the many states. It'll take so long for the news even just to reach from Georgia to Massachusetts. So, being really big, we're less likely to burn down. And he says, quote, the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. And obviously in the age of social media, that's completely false. So all of Madison, all of the founding fathers tinkering so that we could actually make this experiment work and get democracy to work where it had not worked before. And did it work for a couple hundred years, not perfectly, but no system is perfect. Now I think it's falling apart. I think democracy, I wouldn't say it's doomed, but I would say its prospects are much darker than they were 5 years ago, while authoritarian capitalism's prospects are much brighter, certainly than they were 15, 20 years ago. And developing countries that used to all ape the United States, they used to all want a constitution like the United States, they're laughing at us now. They don't want what we have. They want what China has. So I do think that, again, technology is great. In general, connecting people is great. I love my iPhone, but I think that social media has connected us in ways that it's not just that it's too much, it's that it's in ways that encourage moral grandstanding, showing off, sensationalism, dishonesty, preference falsification. And democracy was always fragile. And I think social media has changed so many parameters that it now might be unworkable. I would never, it's always been wrong to bet against the United States, so I'm not betting against us. But I think the odds of catastrophic collapse, of political collapse within 15 years when Gen Z becomes the major, the largest generation, Gen Z, which has so many problems with conflict and with working together across lines of division, I think we could be in very, very big trouble. And I do think that major changes to social media, I can't guarantee that they would save us, but I think that they would help. And I think it's necessary to make those changes.
It's a perfect place to wrap. My guest today has been Jonathan Haidt. If you enjoyed this episode, please read The Coddling of the American Mind and go to heteroxacademy.org, where he deals with a lot of the issues going on campus. And any other plugs for things you have upcoming where people can learn more?
Oh, yeah, depending on people's interests. If you have kids and you want to raise them to be stronger and more resilient, go to letgrow.org. If you're having conflict in your own company, conflict, especially if it's over words and phrases and things that you think people should be able to settle on their own, you go to openmindplatform.org. It's a program we've created to help resolve conflicts over all kinds of differences. And if you care about the state of universities, if you want our universities to create people who can think for themselves and who can welcome differing viewpoints, go to or please consider supporting heteroxacademy.org. We're not trying to help any particular side in the political debate. We're trying to help universities. Universities need viewpoint diversity and norms of civil discourse. That's what we're trying to restore. Well, Erik, thanks for giving me the chance to vent and think about these things and talk with your audience.
It's been a fascinating episode. Thank you very much, John. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.